Perfect. You know, digital transformation is an interesting thing. I think we're in a time when we walk into situations. We can be a startup company, it can be an existing company, and we look to the promise of digital transformation for additional revenue, but at the same time, we're sometimes held back by what they call technology debt, or I guess decisions that we've made to date. And even if you're a newer company, this I think comes into play as you start to progress, and you know, some of these decisions that we make that aren't made properly can bite us later on, and they resurface. And I think the name that we give to that whole bulk of these sort of decisions that we could have made better is technology debt. And just moving to the next slide. Digital transformation is really exciting. I think it provides unprecedented profit capability for companies. And for us, I think, you know, when I say digital transformation for profit, probably the slide should have read digital transformation for fun and profit. It gives us as IT architects unprecedented opportunity to be involved in the business and decision-making aspects of our company and to help chart them through some of these difficult waters that we need to actually achieve profitability at the end of the day. At the same time, I think there's, again, a lot of challenges that we're going to need to face. And in a lot of cases, we have a company that's made some decisions. It could be an older company that's been around for a little bit, maybe 20 years, and they want to cash in on some of the benefits of digital transformation. But they need to deal, if you like, with their IT and business karma. Really, it's another way of saying that those decisions created the environment we have to work with today. And really nothing more. We've got what we got to work with. If we're a newer company, we need to be careful about those decisions so we don't put on this bad technical debt or karma as we go forward. So really the whole premise of this discussion is going to be around how do we handle this whole idea of digital transformation, this really innovative way to go onto the marketplace, capture customers, deal with the competition and disruptive forces. And at the same time, you know, a contingent in the company that goes up to you, we've all experienced it. Yeah, but you got to keep the boilers running. And so we're left with this, or we're seemingly left with this choice between innovation versus, you know, these back-end systems or legacy things that we need to run, or out-of-date technologies that are keeping things going, and somebody saying, yeah, but we got to keep the lights on. So how do we make that trade-off? Well, I'm going to kind of turn to an old teacher, a very old teacher. He's long gone. His name's Socrates. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not into fighting the old, but on building the new. And what I'm really going to talk about is a possible approach that we can apply based on a lot of experience that I've put together from a lot of clients I've worked with. But really how we can achieve this change, how we can actually become innovative and deal with some of this baggage that we carry with us, or make sure that we don't create some of our decisions that turn into baggage in a way that makes sense. And I think the way that we can do that is by reframing the problem a little bit. Instead of thinking of some of the older systems as old, outdated, why don't we look at them all in the light of innovation and in terms of business modeling? And so we really need to understand, although this is, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about information technology, this idea of technology debt and innovation isn't really just about information technology. It applies to a lot of things. It applies to organizational change. It applies to people, getting people up to speed, the training, outsourcing. Every aspect of a company really has to deal with this as we face this idea of innovation versus what we actually have to deal with. So why am I interested in this? Let me tell you a little bit of a story. Many years ago, I was actually taking a course at Stanford on artificial intelligence, and I was in the mess hall at the time, and you know, this was, for me, really exciting. I was interested in new technologies. I was with, at that time, the Brice Waterhouse Emerging Technology Lab, and we were sitting in this course on some of the most up-to-date techniques, and in the table next to me, there was this guy that I started talking to, and he was a COBOL compiler designer. And I thought, you know, my first thought was, well, what wisdom could I glean from this guy? And so I asked him, as a COBOL compiler designer dude, what's the craziest thing that happened to you? And he told me this story. They had built a compiler, a release was for a major COBOL compiler company at the time, and there was an error that they knew about. And every release, because this error was actually part of the release, people would work around it. So what this meant is that everybody made the assumption that the error was in the code. And all the business applications that were written with this COBOL compiler code had workarounds for the error. He decided one day, however, that it was time to fix that error. And guess what? He broke everything. And this started to intrigue me. And this was really my first experience where I came across what we would call technology debt. And it started to raise some questions to me. When does it make sense to fix an error like that? When doesn't it? And we can even look at this in a general context. Why do some things from the old days disappear? Why, for the most part, why is Power Builder largely going out of favor, yet SAP has become so popular as a back-end system? What's the difference? Why is one providing innovative solutions and another option maybe not so much? I think one of the things we find, and it'll be a point that I touch on, is that a delivery platform that mirrors our business platform is really useful. And another thing that actually came out of this as I went through and looked at this is this idea that we need to build prototypes to understand our business models. I think to some extent we need the prototypes to flesh out what we're doing. But really, I think we really need to understand that business models and business understanding is really different than understanding how to build something that enables that business model. And so as I go into this discussion, it's sort of these ideas that sort of frame me coming into this. And I look at, hey, we've all had our own experiences with this, where we're sort of balancing or tempering the new and the old and having to deal with it. So a little bit about me. I work with MNP. I'm a senior technology manager, and I'm responsible for IT architecture. You know what? I think at the end of the day, though, when you talk about something like IT architecture, really the one thing I've learned, it's about being able to apply things as you need to apply them, not blindly apply frameworks. And there's a lot more people involved in it. With that in mind, let's start the presentation. So in this discussion, I want to talk about digital transformation in terms of innovation, technology debt, and change, and the capacity for change. So I really want to make sure that everybody understands what digital transformation is, that we understand what technology debt is, and that we understand the forces that we have to bear on it. You know, if we had unlimited resources and unlimited capacity to change, I think this would be a really easy problem to deal with, but we don't. We have to either deal with the capacity we have, we can increase that capacity, or we have to reframe the problem so that we can maybe hit two birds with one stone. Maybe we can look at business model innovation and value creation and capacity creation as one aspect of it, and really from a business point of view, and then understand how to enable that through basically traceability and tracing that technology and the enablers that actually enable us to build these innovative business models that we call digital transformation. I want to look a little bit at the basis of technology debt, and I'm going to talk a little bit about organizational maturity, but I think what's really important, this discussion talks a little bit to some of the, I think, more conventional concepts around maturity. But at the same time, I think we need to realize that as a company and really trying to achieve value, we're not bounded by any particular phase. We're bound by what we have in place and where we need to go. And that's really where I want the thinking in this discussion to go around, is what's the right way to look at this? What do you need to put in place in the organization to make innovation work at the same time that we're dealing with the technology debt situation and really making the right trade-offs, or at least understanding the basis to make the right trade-offs so that we avoid future technology debt. So let's talk a little bit about digital transformation. It's characteristically identified by 5 domains: customers, value, competition, data, and innovation. Let's face it, customers are where we get revenue. They're an important part of this. Value is what they see out of this, and in a sense, it's the customers and value together that give us, as a company, money. Very important. We need to deal with competition, and we use innovation to somehow navigate through this disruptive landscape. Another interesting statement about digital transformation that makes it really unique is our ability to use data. A lot of older business models were more like products, pushing one way, going to the customer, kind of like media blasts at the customer. And the real differentiator that we find with digital transformation is it's a dialogue. It's an opportunity for the customers to be involved in an interaction with our company. And as we do this, we need to understand that everything about digital, in fact, everything I've talked about so far on this slide about digital transformation is about business. And at the same time, it's also needs technology to enable it. They're not separate. And I think the really important thing going forward is IT architects. And we need to participate in the business. We need to become leaders. We need to drive the changes necessary. And we need to work seamlessly with the business. So one of the big questions that this talk might answer, or at least present a few ideas about how to do it, is how do we interact like that? What's the right things that we need to do? So if we look at digital transformation in a company, this is a really simple diagram that I put together to help illustrate some of the concepts. We have a company, it produces things that have value to the customer, and I represent that production capability as a pipe. And we can put another dimension on here, which is our time to get something out the door. And we call that strategic agility. How quickly can we change things? What's our time to value? And what we're doing with digital transformation is we're adding another dimension to the business value measurements, that our time to deliver, strategic agility, the disruptive value of what we do, not just simple return on investment measures. And this is really important because it really means that there's a lot of effort we need to spend understanding the business model. Another thing that's important is the size of the pipe versus what we're producing, the size of our client base. And part of the discussion is around that capacity and what our ability to change is and what we need to do to put in place to actually enable different business models. So one way that this is looked at, and I don't know if it's the right way, but let's sort of give it a first start, is people get really excited about digital transformation. And I've come across this a lot, probably you have too. And they say, well, you got this thing called the front office, and somehow we're dealing with the clients, they're coming in the door, and this really innovative way of selling to the customer and the systems that are innovative, we call them the front office, are really what enables this digital transformation. And a lot of people talk about it like there's one system in the front, and then somehow there's a back office or another system that's a little bit different. And they say it's sort of a different beast. It's the HR systems, the ERP systems. It's the connection to our suppliers. And well, maybe that's not really innovative. And on the way to this discussion, I had a really interesting talk with a friend who's actually in the financial industry, fairly senior. And we were sitting down over lunch, and I made a comment that, geez, they sort of got, there's some view, a bimodal approach where the back office isn't viewed as innovative. And his comment to me was like, what are you talking about? The back office needs to innovate just as much as the front end. For example, the example he gave in the discussion was the idea of having innovative invoicing tied into other business processes. So I started to investigate this a little bit more. I'm just going to hold that thought and find out what really needs to be done. But in the meantime, I think this popular notion is there's a front office, there's a back office, and guess what? There's sort of a technology match that fits either one, and we just put it in place, and we use the appropriate model. But the problem with this whole thing is that the back office is probably a lot more important than we ever imagined. I actually gathered just a few statistics from the financial industry, and talking about back office innovation, some interesting stuff. This is actually from a 2013 report. And my only criticism with this report, it talked to things like savings from operations. It didn't really talk to how the back office innovation could actually enable the front end. And we'll get to that towards the end of our talk with a simple example. But just for now, look at this. The back office can help banks realize a 30% savings in overall cost. 10 to 20% of contact center volumes are the result of execution issues in the back office. Well, why is that? Well, it's because as we move to a more innovative digital platform, the customer interactions flow right to the back end of the company. So I'm really skeptical that you can separate out the back end from the front end, treat them differently. I think they both need to be innovated on, and they both need to enable the business model. In fact, if we look at some statistics, if we digitalize operations in a company, we find out that leading companies that actually look at doing that end-to-end and going into the back end to digitize the back end operations as part of understanding how to implement innovation are 2.4 times more successful, according to a major study that was conducted by it actually was published in Information Week. And so what we're really talking about is how do we build in end-to-end process and value as part of enabling our innovative business models. Maybe the view we should be looking at isn't front end or back end, but really kind of understanding what we need to do. So the metaphor here, it's sort of a loose metaphor. It's like we looked at the front end, we looked at the back end of the house, but what we really need to do is look at a point of function. In this case, maybe we have to build a roof over a section, and guess what? We need to design a vertical swath that goes right down to the physical details. And if I miss out, say, dealing with the foundation here, it's just going to fall down. And I think we have the same problem when we look at business model innovation. So how do we deal with the fact that there's technology and business model innovation? Well, I think the first trick to the problem is to decouple the business model from the underlying foundation. The success of a business model and everything we talked about digital transformation really has very little to do, I guess, essentially with how we enable it, as long as we are able to enable it, of course. And what I mean by that is the business model stands on its own. We can evaluate it, we can look at the business model strictly from a business point of view. So why don't we do that more often? Why don't we separate that out, understand what we're looking at? Let's capture things like the profitability potential of the model. Let's understand who the client base is, what we're dealing with. And we'll talk a little bit more with one method that we can use to capture business model innovation. Once we've understood what we're trying to innovate, then let's look at how we enable it. And that's going to drive down from the business model to understanding absolutely how our architecture is going to support that business model. And it starts by going down to business capability. And we see this in a lot of methodologies, and it's really, what business capabilities do I need to support this model? And as I drill down from those business capabilities, what are the enablers that I need to put in place in the organization? And I guess another way we can look at this is really we're starting with the business model. We've got a single business model. We drill down. We say, okay, for this business model, what's the set of business enablers and capabilities that I need? And then let's look at what those enablers are. And if we keep on cascading and drilling down deeper, we might look at what are the organizational changes we need to enable this. There's often a people component. What are the technology changes that I need? And interestingly enough, we may want to make choices to maximize or minimize one of these components based on our particular organization. For example, if I have a company that's a little bit slow to change, or maybe limited people, I may want to minimize the organizational impact by pushing things off on technology. So the idea of understanding the enablers and the trade-offs we make between them, I think, is really important in understanding how we're going to implement some of these innovative business ideas. Here's another view, really providing another detail of this. Here you might have various business model innovative platforms, 1 and 2, and I call that the business model innovation layer. And we just need to drill down to understand how to build each one. We start to look at business capabilities. We need to understand if those business capabilities exist, where do we find them? What are the enablers that let them happen? Or if they don't exist, what do we need to enable them? And I really didn't go into much more detail, but this can go right down into a service layer where we can understand the software that we require, where we can go underneath that to understand the infrastructure on the technology side. On the organization side, we can understand how we need to change the organization. For example, we may find that the office setup is not conducive to a certain business model, and we may want to change it to reflect that, and that becomes an enabler. And if that is the case, then we want to put that into our plan and understand what's involved to do that. And maybe we want to look at that capacity to change in the future and how to introduce it. So as we drill down, I think there's two things that we're going to come out. One, how do we increase capacity to support a business model? Two, is there a way that we're actually building capacity to change? And as we think about this, the human side to this, looking at this, as an IT architect, or the art of it, is really how do we temper both of those together? So what's a great way to capture the business model? Well, something that I've used very successfully is what's called business model canvas to capture a business model. And various people advocate using this and the idea that you can actually, in about 10 or 15 minutes, really put down all the salient features of the business model. You can brainstorm through it. You can get the business people talking about different ideas and the salient features and the important features of those ideas in order to put them in place. This canvas, I'm not going to go into detail, is a great methodology that can be used to really understand what you're trying to put in place. And each of the boxes here actually addresses a key element that we talked about in the, or a key domain of digital transformation. We're talking about the customer. The data part of this is implicit in how we're building this and what we need to actually enable some of the channels. I sometimes find myself bringing that out and elaborating a little bit more on the data that I require, just because I find that this is a little bit light in a practical application. But it actually is in the model if you document fully. Yeah, so I'll leave that to the anybody that wants to dig into that a little bit more. It's a great method to capture different business models. And if I want to say sell something or an idea, I may look at 2 or 3 business models. And the data is really what rejigs the model, in my opinion. It's where do I learn something? How can I change where I use the data? Let's look at conventional sales. In the past, I would put something out, sell it. I'd have a long cycle to get data whether the customer liked it or not. And this was the business model. Now, if I move some of that information sooner, maybe I'm on Amazon and the customer is looking for something particular, I can use that information right away to steer them to what they want. So a lot of business model innovation is about what you know and where you know it in this model. That's an entirely discussion of its own, though. Once we have this business model, the next question is how can I drill down into this to understand what I need to enable the model? So we've decoupled it, but they are related. And the tool that I find most useful for that is the Cranfield Business Dependency Network as a useful tool. It allows one to understand all the enablers, not just technology enablers, but anything that I need to put in place. So, do I need to put this piece of technology in? Yeah, okay. And it identifies that. Do I need to put something else in? Like, do I need to train people on how to use this? Is there organizational change that's going to be part of implementing this? And I really think sometimes, we talk about technology debt, but it's really not just about technology. We even find it in areas, the same root causes in organizations and resistance to change. And how do you deal with changing things that are already in place? Even though our focus is a bit more technology, this tool helps flesh that out across different enabler spaces. You can also link, expected benefits. Are we meeting investment objectives? Are we meeting the investments to components as you actually look at this tool? So it lets us look at things a little bit more fine-grained. And even though there's a set of business capabilities for a business model, we may get benefits from partial implementation. Again, that's another discussion. Here's an example of a simplified Cranfield Business Dependency Network. And this is really simplified into a few columns. It's just a sample. And again, what we're looking at for business changes, what enabling changes do we need to put in place in the business? And so that column is going to talk about things like introducing a project management campaign, reducing marketing staff time on admin activities. And then we look at the IT enablers that we need to support either business changes directly or other enabling changes. We can talk to the benefits and we can talk to investment objectives. So we're starting to build a tool here that not only lets us flesh out and get some sort of traceability from our business capability requirements, but it also lets us identify leading indicators of success. And from this, we can also look at things to see that our venture is in fact successful So if I'm building a website and I have website code, that may not be a good leading indicator, but I think we can get, as we drill into this in a practical way, a really good understanding that things are on track or not on track. And we can also percolate some of this up at a governance level across some of our ventures to see that we're doing the right things. Let's take a look now at why we get technology debt. From a technology point of view, I think one of the first causes, and whether it's planned or unplanned, I don't want to really get too deep on that. There's a lot of great discussions on that, and that's not really where this discussion, the sweet spot is. I think the sweet spot is that, yeah, we do have things like technology impedance mismatches. I do have situations where I've used one technology for one application, maybe a different technology for another one. Maybe it's a remnant of a company moving from a time when it was in silos to now a more modern time when things are more connected and we have to deal with that. You know, another common mismatch is around semantics. We have different databases that we have to connect. In some cases, this alignment needs to be corrected with, you know, bridges. So we find things like with data, for instance, with semantic mismatches, we find ourselves implementing things like master data. Not saying we're ever going to totally get rid of it. We may have to live with it, but at least we need to know the right things to make an informed decision. So what are those right things? I think one way of looking at this is the overall granularity of how we're exposing some of the services and capabilities, and how those services are or features are bundled with other features. So ideally, I want to be able to change one service at a time or a piece of a service. So I want something very granular. And as an organization evolves to the ultimate point where it can achieve digital transformation, I think service agility becomes really an important factor. We want to avoid, of course, redundant implementations because, you know what, you have to align things with additional code that we have to maintain. And that just, again, that's the kind of technology debt that takes extra work. We may have gaps that we've missed in our initial assessments. I think that's another kind of an error. It's not in what we put in place, but maybe what we failed to put in place by not thinking about something or fully understanding some of the future possibilities. Process and data can often be confused based on things that we did in the past. Hey, they were set up in a lot of, especially a lot of more mature and older companies, to support pre-existing models. So we really need to think about how we're going to unravel them as we go forward. So that's a really, I think, a big, maybe not pure technology debt, but certainly something that standard technology can enable in many cases. And the other thing that we need to be aware of is that if we're really going to save costs, you actually have to retire things. If I have an old database that nobody's using, if I'm still paying for the licensing in that database, it's still causing me money. And I want to be able to retire these things and decommission them to realize savings at some point. So that's a brief overview. There's a lot of literature on what technology debt is, right? Some people talk about it as a code thing. I think that it's a lot more than that. It's a way of looking at some of our past mistakes, whether they were made knowingly or unknowingly, and realizing that if we don't somehow address them over time, they're going to cost us more and more money. And certainly, a good example, if I was still running things on an old language, like say RPG3, it's going to be harder to fix than current technologies. So how do I keep things current, I think, is a big issue. So how do we find out if we're in a company at a high level, though, without going into the weeds? Although I'm sure, a lot of the people that are doing, the developers, solution architects, a lot of the architecture team probably have the feel. But the real question is, what are the questions that they're going to ask that are letting them sort of make that comment that there's technology debt? How do we measure it and identify it? This is a great chart I took from an article in the CFO magazine. And what I like about it is it talks about technology debt from a high level. It talks about what do you see your leadership do? How effective are they? Are they aligned with the vision of the business? Do you have any oversight into the IT function? I guess sometimes this is called governance. I think even more important is a mentoring capability to understand how to gently steer the harbingers of the IT capability. Are the systems we have relevant to what we're doing? And I think there's some important decisions that need to be made here, and you can really see right off if we have systems that are supporting what we have, or maybe not. Maybe there's a lot of baggage. Are we spending money on the right things? Are we overspending? Is there misallocation of funds? Are we underspending and missing business opportunities? So again, this is a question that can't really be answered entirely out of a business context. And finally, we talk about process chaos. Do the processes make sense? Are they efficient? Can they be unraveled even more? This diagram is really great because it provides a way of assessing technology debt, and it's a part of a more detailed approach that we can use when we're coming into an organization to determine things that we may want to look at. So let's talk a little bit more about debt in some of these areas. So IT leadership fundamentally steers the ship. Having a mindset of looking for opportunity and innovation, and the idea of being able to go end to end, and using that innovative time, that time that we're doing something innovative, putting a model in place to refurbish existing systems, is an easy win. It gives us a nice time when we can update something, when it makes sense to update something. What's our risk aversion and tolerance for change? Are we making sure that as we actually put new solutions in place, we're doing things that may not be front and center? Security is a great example. It's really important. The credibility of every company relies on proper privacy and security measures, but I think most companies do build it in, but are they thinking about it in innovative terms and saying that this security can provide advantages? Maybe not enough. Maybe they are. It's just a question we need to look at. Are we making the right organizational choices to support the people? I think that one of the biggest debts that we face is the legacy that we have on terms of staff to do things. If we're trying to build innovative systems and we have a lot of people that maybe were more aligned to some of the older technologies, some of them are going to have a hard time changing, and there's been some really great discussions on dealing with that. I am a little bit of the opinion that that has really to a large part driven this idea that people like Gartner have promoted of bimodal execution. I think that that's really more of a driving force in that you have certain people you have to work with. It's more of a limitation on the enabler than on the nature of actually digital transformation or dealing with other sorts of debts. And I think if we realize that these enablers are important things that we need to look at, we need to sort of rejuvenate, we start to come up with some ideas about how we can do it. And if you actually think about that diagram about what goes in place to build the debt, we can start to put in place different options and understand that there may be alternative ways to realize business models. And we can start to look at, what can we do, what options make sense for the value of the opportunity, for our capacity to change, and to enable us in the future. As we talk about all this, though, I think there's a sort of a hidden thing that every company deals with, and it's where are we in terms of maturity? What are the I guess the harsh realities of what we have in place? So as I talk about this, I think each of these has sort of its own benefits, but it brings also kind of its own disease that we need to deal with. And so as we go through the discussion, what we can do is draw out a lot of, I think, best practices or almost like avoiding disease, things that we can do to keep ourselves healthier. As in business silos, what does technology debt mean? Technology debt in that environment, it's really talking to individual solutions and extraneous code or shortcuts that we've taken to get something out the door. And by doing that, we may be missing opportunities, and we may be getting things like technology impedance mismatches. As the organization matures and we start to standardize on technology, it's evolving also. Now we have, eliminated or, attempted to eliminate some of the technology impedance mismatches, but we still have process issues to deal with that we haven't put in place. And ultimately, I think we want to have this view of moving towards digital transformation. Although I think there's a really good argument to be put in place that we need to move through successive waves of maturity in the organization, I think it's equally valid to say that we can also look at digital transformation and ways to get there just because people haven't successfully done it with old models, I think newer models and newer approaches and better IT business collaboration can make that possible. So in terms of architecture maturity, we kind of went through this already, a summary of some of the types of debt that we have to deal with. So I won't really spend a lot of time on this slide. The question now is, how do we introduce it? Well, let's look to some of these measures and some areas in our company to talk about how we're going to actually introduce digital transformation and at the same time reframe technology debt and eliminate it or reduce it and control it as part of introducing that innovation. So the first question is, what does the leadership need to do? And we'll go through each of these areas in detail, a little bit more detail anyways. First of all, the leadership needs to understand the changes and the enablers and the different pathways that we've identified to actually enable something, what's required to put each one of them in place, how it impacts the capacity to change, how it matches against the company's vision. And I think another important part of this is understanding that if we don't put an enabler in place, what will it mean to the business modeler and to rolling out the business model? What will it mean to future capacity? I may knowingly decide that, I'm not going to change the organization and I'll live with some of the inefficiencies in that business model because the change that it would introduce might be more costly than the benefit. But at least I know I'm going to do that or not do that and have the right information. So part of this leadership function is understanding what's happening. And it's really important that IT leadership is able to work with business and at the same time have oversight over what they're doing. So we talk about oversight of the IT function. Are we collecting the right information to enable business capability? Are we putting the right lead indicators that track technology debt? So, we're looking at this way of basically assessing our debt. So are we putting the right things in place for our organization that measure it? Are we doing the right things in the code? Are we avoiding putting systems that don't fit together? Are we ensuring that we're actually aligned to capabilities? And I'll probably mention this a few times, but if we're not doing something at business value, why are we doing it? Maybe we need to rethink what's up with that and really start to get a little bit more focused. A great way to do that is to look at other industry benchmarks and standards and see how to apply things. The coupling with the financial department is really important, I think, moving forward. We're going to see a lot more of this. We're going to see, I think, organizations that are going to start to integrate IT as much more of a financial function. We're seeing a lot more chief financial officers taking a role in IT. And in some cases, they work with the CIO. In some cases, they're directly responsible for that function. And the only way I think they're going to really be effective is, A, that they're going to make sure that they decouple business from the technology and push out into the enablement, understand what the technology does, but leave it to some of the people that understand the technology to really determine how the technology does that. And at the same time, we can also put things, we can look at our balance sheets, we can look at certain ratios and key performance indicators as we go through time. Is the operations expense as a percentage of my revenue in line with industry standards, for instance? I think those are important questions that aren't just financial, but they need to reflect downwards to the IT group and as part of alignment and alignment in different areas to the business capabilities that we need to provide. We need to, as part of this digital transformation, use our data internally to be a little bit more agile and start to understand the trade-offs and what systems we want to put in place. Are the systems we're building relevant? Are there overlaps or redundancies that we need to deal with that we should be looking at a little bit differently? I think one of the great achievements of our times is this idea of platforms. We've seen like ERP systems, J.D. Edwards, things like SAP come on board that really capture as a platform really relevant business ideas and present them. And what you find is a lot of the underlying knowledge doesn't change. What does change is how we use that knowledge in the business process, and that's really the realm of business model innovation. So I think what's important, I think what's happening is our understanding of data, how that data relates to things like ontologies is fairly static. How we actually go into a disruptive marketplace and enable our operations end-to-end, that's really what changes. So what we need to do, what a lot of these platforms have done is recognize the static portions and at the same time allow a lot of people to build agility around those features and fine-grained services that they expose. We want to reduce where possible customization. Why don't we leave things like technology and technology innovation in the hands of people who are working with those platforms? And this goes, you know, front end, back end, whatever. If I'm leveraging ideas that are being produced by other people and functionality that's being pushed out, I can still be innovative in how I use this as a process to enable digital transformation. Am I spending money on the right stuff? You know, one of the arguments is that, well, you know, I got an HR system and somehow it doesn't go to the bottom line. Yeah, actually it does go to the bottom line. And we need to really rethink what it does. We sometimes find that there's this, not a decoupling, but more a disconnection between the business benefits and what we're spending money on. You'll provide a really simple example of how that can happen, but it can get to the point where we start to cut innovation off at a point, and at the same time, you know, clip our ability to provide things. We want to be able to redesign processes and data and make sure that those processes innovatively support digital transformation. So let's really, you know, go through a few things that I think are kind of like myths, and I'm going to go through them at a fairly high level. It's just, I think they're maybe not incorrect, or maybe the word myth is a bit strong as I go through this. I tend to look at them as maybe errors or possible blind spots in our thinking. So the first one is we start to look at legacy systems, that they're not innovative, they're legacy, we deal with them differently because they're back end than front end. Because they're not innovative, we don't need to change them as quickly. I don't think so. I think that there's, when you consider some of the information, like there's often twice as many people in the back end as the front end, for instance. Maybe we can get a lot of bang for our buck by looking at legacy systems and dealing with them as part of innovation. It's harder to think about, but I think there's a lot of potential there that we can mine. Sometimes we go into a solution and we say, well, we're just going to add technology and it's not going to change anything else. I don't think that's really true. I think we need to make sure that we're enabling everything end to end. But at the same time, we need to understand where everything fits. Organizationally, we need to understand, the level of impact in the organization. Do I need to bring in organizational change management? Can I push things on technology to minimize it? I think we need to have more of those discussions. Most important, we need to get out of rigidly labeling everything we do. There's no front office, there's no back office. Those are labels that we put on things that were helpful. Maybe they're not as helpful anymore. We need to start looking at end-to-end processes and enablement. Are technology debt and innovation at odds? I don't really think so. I think we can reframe this problem and look at the new and look at our spending as a way to reduce debt. And if you think about it, that's not really unlike what we do in a household. I like to buy things today. And if I look at my spending patterns, that's kind of what determines where I'm going to be at tomorrow. We can build in maturity approaches to our corporation to provide maturity as a strategy to achieve better debt control. So before we come to the end of this, I'd like to just talk about something really simple. I had a really nice conversation with a few friends around Wi-Fi. You know, a lot of proposals, a lot of things come out, and they take it off. They say, well, Wi-Fi, you know, on the floor has no value. It doesn't innovate in the customer side. A very simple thing like Wi-Fi maybe, though, is potential that we're not really getting. Maybe it produces interaction in the back end that actually would improve, you know, time to customer value that could be an enabler in the business model. Have we looked at that? Well, maybe we should. Does it improve our capability to change the organization? Well, maybe if I don't have cables in place, I can move tables around more freely and I can use people. And yet, this type of system, like a simple, you know, Wi-Fi endpoint, won't get put into as an enabler in our strategy. It sort of gets left out, and what it can do gets left out because we're not thinking end to end. And really, that's what I'm really looking at, is moving a little bit away from walking our thinking into labels, going a little bit more to end to end, putting innovation first. not having sacred cows in the organization and saying, well, this system's free from innovation because it's old. Well, maybe that's exactly why we need to look at changing it and look at the cost involved of moving it forward. So where do we get to today? Well, we had a great discussion, I think, on digital transformation, but it requires IT and business working together. We need to understand that everything a business does has to be enabled somehow. And we need to have those dialogues about how to put the right stuff in place. We need to drill down, put traceability in place to get innovation happening. And most important, from the perspective of this thing, we need to prioritize our projects in a way that we're eliminating debt through new innovative projects. Thank you very much for spending time and talking. I now, if there's any